How are you two?
Dude,
Great.
wonderful. How are you?
I'm okay. Been a little
That's
sick.
it. Oh,
I've been a little sick. I
yeah.
had uncontrollable chills and fever last night.
Oh
Mhm.
no.
I
Those are
know.
the worst.
It
It's the
is when
spring.
you're a grown ass man. my,
You were writing your will,
my wife
right?
is like, "Shut up.
You're such a baby.
Go to
And man,
bed.
it's
Get
a
out of
real
here."
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, first episode of Beyond the Binder with
Yeah.
Adam Tuttle and his
Cool
special
name, by the
special
way,
guest.
Jason. Pretty cool name.
Thank you. That's what I do. Cool names. Well, Adam, I've been working with Adam for a few months now, and he talks about the binder a lot. I'm sure, Michelle, you've seen the binder. Have you seen the binder?
Yes.
Yeah. Are you in love with the binder, or do you like?
No,
Yeah.
not
Okay.
really. We
You
need to
probably
move beyond the binder.
we're gonna move. Yeah, I gotta move beyond binder. Yeah, it's kind of hard to imagine that hotels are still managing their standards in the way that they are with pen and paper and binders and emails and spreadsheets. Uh, or even apps that were intended for something else that somebody just threw in a checklist. It doesn't seem to add up, doesn't seem to work very well, but here we are. Well, why don't we kick off with let's just talk about what standards are,
Yeah.
because it can be kind of broad, right?
Yeah. At least from my perspective, standards can be it's so broad and they can come from such a variety of sources and really can, when you say the word standards, I think to a lot of different people that might mean a lot of different things just because of the broad nature of standards. So for me, we like to say, at Yippee, we like to say that standards equal expectations, right?
Hmm.
Things that need to be done and or are an expectation of, the care or quality or status of something. So, when you look at a standard and it could be something as simple as, the guest name needs to be used. It's probably one of the most famous standards in our industry. But it could also be a standard could be that the refrigerator needs to be at a certain temperature, or that something needs to be checked within a certain frequency. So anytime that there's an organization that has expressed some level of expectation, there needs to be a standard developed around it, or at least articulated in some way.
And Michelle, I've heard you talk about one of the first things you do once a hotel hires you. You go in and you're almost like a secret shopper, right? I mean, you go in and you kind of get the firsthand experience of whether or not they're essentially executing standards, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And typically, when you go to a specific property and, maybe you meet one of the leaders for lunch or whatnot, the service is just epic, right? It's excellent. Everything is on point because you are with someone that they know, right? And they have to check some boxes. So having that experience where it's just me and I can understand how things look like from the guest perspective, but then also the added value of knowing what those guidelines or those expectations that Adam is referring to, what those are, then it makes the experience or the reporting on the experience a lot more insightful.
So, Adam, talk to us about the various sources of standards.
Yeah, I love that you asked that because there are so many. So hold on to your hat here. When
Hmm.
we think of standards, oftentimes the best examples or the most common examples might come from like brand standards, right? So if you're operating under a franchise or a corporate run hotel, you're probably familiar with communicated brand standards, and that could come from a flag that you're operating, like if you're a Marriott, for example, and you're a Westin, right? You're going to get the Marriott and Westin standards that need to come from that. But there's so many other sources. So as locally as the specific things that a general manager would want done, or a department head, hey, I really like it to be this way or that way. Owners of properties have standards or expectations that they have of how, especially a lot of heavily around the aesthetic, or maybe the flow of or the sequence of service, how that should go. And then, of course, additionally with accolades, right? So if you're working, a partnership with any type of accolade partner, they're going to have standards that they want to communicate with you. The government, right, and your local health department, fire codes, all of those, in order for you to operate, right, those entities also have standards that they need to communicate to an organization and say, hey, if you want to be in business, you need to be doing these things as well. And so oftentimes I think hoteliers get confused, or they don't take in wholly the whole picture of what standards are out there and the things that they have to do to comply with. And that really makes it challenging when you're trying to communicate that to a frontline team member, where you can say, hey, there are probably 500 standards that you need to be aware of that are directly pertaining to the successful delivery of your role.
Yeah. Michelle, when you go in, do you typically have those standards? Do you like recognize gaps? I know, Adam, you do that, right?
Yeah.
When you were
Yeah.
doing your consulting. Michelle, is that kind of your world too?
Yeah, same situation. In many cases, like Adam is referring to, team members have so much, right? There's like almost standard overload. So if it's not properly packaged, it's very difficult for team members, especially on an entry level, to be able to drive those standards to the finish line.
Yeah, I would imagine. Ooh.
And like, I'm gonna jump back in, like that gap that exists. I gotta be smart because of the screen. The gap that exists so often times of just not recognizing that there are standards that exist that are important that just haven't been communicated, right? I think, like, Michelle, you've got to have seen that so often, where it's just like,
Yeah,
these standards
absolutely.
exist, and they might even be known different levels within the organization. But and I want to be really clear that not all the time is it that standards are known up here and then not communicated down here, if we're talking about a linear org chart, right? Sometimes the frontline staff or the the end user is very well of restrictions or standards or expectations that are had, and those don't get communicated upward, right? And senior leadership just isn't aware that that exists. So that gap exists in both directions.
So where do these standards usually reside within an organization? The binder, but
Sometimes the binder, right? And sometimes nowhere,
no.
right? which is the worst case scenario.
Post-it notes.
Sometimes, yeah, I mean, I am not even kidding. I have seen, and Michelle, I'll be interested to see what you've seen. I have seen a notebook passed from manager to manager to manager, right? From like, this tribal knowledge of like, okay, when I'm gonna leave, like the president leaves a note for the next president, like here's the binder, here's the Bible.
So old
These are the things
school,
that you need.
and it's the Bible, right? The
Yes,
Bible.
the
Yeah.
Bible. And it's like, and it's all handwritten notes, it's like scratched out. And sometimes it's just the policies, it lives within SOPs, right? Which there is a very big difference between standards and SOPs, right? SOPs should be made up of standards in a way, but there is this concept that I've seen the old rusty dusty binder, these notebooks. I've seen sticky notes. I went to a property, I kid you not, and there was a sticky note that was 10 years old. It was 10 years old, and it was held on by layers of tape. And you could see where it had been ripped and copy stains and all these things. And they're like, don't lose that sticky note. You're just like, you've got to be kidding me. Your process relies on a sticky note on how to do things. And truthfully though, a lot of it is never actually written. A lot of it lives here, And I think that this is the plague of our industry the most. And it's the thing that we saw that was most devastating coming out of COVID was
Totally.
it was locked in people's heads that never came back,
Yeah.
right? And now hoteliers are, we all dealt with that of the last 3-4 years coming out of COVID. And if you haven't, then maybe you just opened a business and you're feeling the strain of what that actually looks like. And so they live in all these various sources. And sometimes it's digital, right? Like if you're with a franchise, then they're going to have like an intranet that you need to access. But again, it's not comprehensive, at least not that I've seen. The place that has the home for everything.
Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
know. Have you seen that too, Michelle? And I mean, I'm sure you've seen
Yes,
things. Yeah.
absolutely. The Bible is so funny. And I think you and I, Adam, were chatting the other day about coming into properties and saying, okay, can I see, working with a specific department? Can
Yeah.
I see your SOPs? It's like the first thing that you ask for. And they're like, yeah, well, and they start going around in circles, and you're thinking, oh no, there are no SOPs. Or when was the last time that you actually pulled it out and walked someone through it? And the
Yeah.
other thing that you and I, Adam, were discussing was how during COVID, there were so many of our colleagues that were left on property, like your GM or maybe your chief engineer, that they were like the only people left on property during the shutdown. And having these conversations with different colleagues, how are things doing and what do you do? Well, I spend the whole day rewriting my housekeeping SOP or my front desk SOP. And I'm thinking to myself, when was the last time you did this? Number one. Number two,
Ah,
if you are updating your housekeeping SOP related to sanitization, we have a problem. Like you have a bigger problem in your hands because clearly your team hasn't been following through with any of the most normal steps in any process to make sure that we keep people safe. So,
yep.
standards, like Adam was saying, come from many different sources, but then how do we make sure that we narrow all of that down depending on what level we are targeting? And then at the same time, where do we house that so that it's live and changes can be made live and anyone can access them, right? I think that's what is going to bring an edge to most operations once we start doing this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Michelle, why do you think it's important to have standards?
It's critical to have standards, right? Because like Adam mentioned, it's you're setting the expectation. Standards serve as your norms or your guidelines that will ensure that the quality is there, ensure that the performance is what it needs to be, so that the service and the operation run smoothly and the guest or your customer gets what they're expecting from your brand, right? It helps ensure consistency and that you have all of your safety in check and that you are going with respecting any government specifications, right? Standards are critical. And I think, like, because of standard overload, many properties don't follow through with standards in many cases, right? Because they're so caught in the whirlwind. And the standard, for what I see in many operations, it's kind of like a separate entity to your company culture. And that's a big problem when you're able to bridge the gap between your standards and your company culture, and you make the standards part of, so people can live it, can breathe it, can think it, can,
Yes.
right? When that happens, then standards come in naturally. You don't have to think about it so much.
Mm.
So it's standards are critical. It's your compass.
Anything to
Yeah.
add, Adam?
Oh my gosh. Okay, how do I keep this in the time frame that we have? Because I mean, look, when it comes down to it, you think, and I think I actually said this the other day, like when we hear the word standards, I guarantee you none of you, no one listening is like, yes, I love standards. Like this is my favorite part of my job, right? Maybe there are the nerds out there like me that feel that way. But typically it's not. But I will tell you that with what happens when you don't have standards, when they are not clearly defined, and when you don't have them aligned with your company organization and that culture, is you have an unscalable product. When you do not have standards, you cannot control your financials. You cannot control your turnover, your hiring, your onboarding. All of that becomes different, because what happens if you don't have a direction, if you don't have clearly dictated and detailed, this is how we operate, then you're leaving it up to people to invent. And that gap will always be filled. They'll say, well,
Yeah.
this is nice to me, this is friendly to me, or this is the way I did it at my last job, right? And until an organization can say, well, this is how we function, this is how we want to behave, it will always be a free-for-all, and people will always come in, and then managers will have hard times managing. The coaching conversations get ugly, right? And it gets unclear, and now you're dealing, your HR team is just riddled with challenges of saying, oh gosh, and it just makes it difficult. So, piggybacking off of what Michelle's saying, without standards, you don't have an organization.
Yeah. Standards reduce the likelihood of error, right?
Period.
Minimizes the risk. Yeah.
And on every department of your operation, right? On every level of that.
Well, let's wrap up with the last question. And I mean, so explain why you think it's important to digitize your standards.
Mm. All right, I'll go, and then that way I'll make sure I have time to leave for Michelle. Look, I think that let's say this: there's good, better, and best. Please, everyone listening, please get standards. Get them from wherever it is that is important, right? From your accolades, from your ownership, from your branding, all of those, get them. And if the best thing you can do is put them in a binder, like put them in a binder, right? But there comes what happens is when you have those standards, one of the limitations that you have is that you will only be able to improve your operation that correlates with your ability to manually update and record that information. So if you're running a hotel, if you're sitting there and you're a general manager and you have 500 employees, 200 employees, how are you going to make sure that every 200 employee gets those standards, knows them, and is aware of the updates? And then how do you know as a leader that your department is performing, or your operation, is performing the way it should be? You're going to do that for all 200 people. That it's impossible to digest that amount of data from a paper and pen or print perspective. When we move to digital, we're not replacing jobs or anything like that. What we're doing is we're better serving the team that we have.
Absolutely. You're accelerating the speed of the
Yeah.
operation. Yeah.
Everything. You can communicate, you can update your standards faster, you can update them more efficiently, you can collaborate through across standards more efficiently and effectively, and you can actually start getting data, right? Things that will actually help drive information and improve your operation. You want to improve your financials, standards, and look at your data. You want to improve guest satisfaction, look at your standards and the data that come from that. Period, right? Without that, you will always be slow and be missing. I think that's the key part there. You're going to be missing critical data that other operations have, and they'll get the scoop on you.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. It will not only speed up the process, but also allow some of those team members that spend so much time recording things, updating things, and so on behind a desk to have that opportunity to explore a different area within the department. So now you're also enhancing the development of your own people.
Yeah, very good. All right. It's a good place to stop, I think. And we'll tackle another topic soon. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
Jason. Thanks, Michelle.